We are entering the 53rd year. And when we think about nationalization, yesterday we had a webinar titled, Is Nationalization Relevant Today? And today we are going to discuss the plus and minus of privatization of banks. Why plus and minus? There are a lot of people who think that privatization is good. They quote that the public sector banks are always crowded. You go to the private banks, their atmosphere is better, less customers. There are many things. But they don't realize that in this country, most of the private banks which were started from 18th century onwards have failed miserably. The only private sector banks which have survived, almost all of them based in Kerala, Federal Bank, Dhanlaxmi Bank, South Indian Bank, Catholic Syrian Bank. These banks were started by the Swadeshi movement. And they cannot be really seen as a private sector bank. They were more service oriented. They were for helping the public as a whole. And they have survived. Other than that, the private banks which have survived are the ones which were nationalized. There are some big private banks which now they talk about, the ICICI. We have seen what happened to Chanda Kochar, HDFC, Axis Bank. These banks have always have had ups and downs, and all these three banks were formed out of public sector. ICICI was Industrial and Investment Corporation of India. HDFC was again a Housing Development Finance Corporation. Axis Bank was born out of UTI, Unit Trust of India. So these were supported by the government, and that's how they have survived. The exceptions today are the Federal Bank and a few other banks, which I mentioned already. But if the government's intention of privatizing the public sector succeeds, what is going to happen in future is a big question. That is why we have invited eminent scholars, experts, Dr. Anita, who is chairing this session. She is the General Secretary of the Federal Bank Officers Association. She is also a Senior Vice President of the All India Bank Officers Confederation. And the Federal Bank Officers Association has a unique achievement of running a engineering college, Federal Institute of Technology. She is the chairman of FISAT. And she has done her doctorate studying the performance of self-help groups in Kerala, especially those who are linked to the banking system. So I cordially welcome Dr. Comrade P. Anita for this webinar. We have
Thank you, Comrade.
another learned scholar, Comrade Murali Sundarajan. He is the General Secretary of the AIBOC Officers Federation and also the President of the All India Bank Officers Confederation, which has 83% of the banking community as membership in the organization. The All India Bank Officers Confederation has also given a call for a massive resistance against privatization. Comrade Murali is a real scholar. He reads quite a lot, very knowledgeable, and a good orator. So I welcome Comrade Murali Sundarajan on behalf of People First and Center for Financial Accountability, and also on behalf of all the participants. Then we have Comrade Priya Dharshini, a young, energetic lady who is working with Center for Financial Accountability, who has been spearheading the bank charges campaign, which forced the State Bank of India to withdraw the circular on the minimum balance charges. And she also is regularly participating in various national and international webinars. So I welcome Comrade Priya Dharshini on behalf of People First and also on behalf of Center for Financial Accountability and also on behalf of each one of you. Then we have a learned, another scholar, Comrade V.K. Prasad, practicing advocate at present. Comrade V.K. Prasad was the president of the Federal Bank Officers Association. So he knows the in and out of private sector, how it functions. He was also the State Secretary of All India Bank Officers Confederation, Kerala unit, which under his leadership was so vibrant. It is vibrant now also. Kerala has that uniqueness of the trade union movement. Comrade V.K. Prasad was uh, sent, made to go on a VRS using some tricks by the management. He did not bother, and he is into practicing law, and he is also working with the cooperative sector. He is working with the other trade union movements in Kerala. So I welcome Comrade V.K. Prasad on behalf of People First, Center for Financial Accountability, and also on behalf of each participant. Finally, I also welcome all the participants who are in the Zoom connection, those who are in the Facebook page, and those who are watching it in the YouTube. I welcome each one of you, and I'll hand over the session to Comrade Anita. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Comrade Franco, Thomas Franco. A very warm good evening to all the participants of this webinar. Dear speakers of today's webinar, very eminent personalities, Comrade Murali Sundarajan, our president, national president of our All India Bank Officers Confederation, Comrade Priya Dharshini from Center for Financial Accountability. The center is coordinating these programs, a week-long program in the backdrop of Bank Nationalisation Day, which happened to be yesterday. Starting with yesterday, there is a series of programs, as I understand, webinars, and dear Comrade V.K. Prasad, who is my own leader and who is the motivation for me to be part of such a trade union movement. And all the other eminent personalities who is participating in this webinar, as well as the other participants who are listening to the webinar, as well as ready to be a part of the discussions. The topic that has been decided for today's webinar is plus and minus of private sector, privatization and public sector. So this is actually this topic, this concept itself is we can say it is a relatively new or relatively a new thought in the real background of the economy when our Indian, after independence, when our first Prime Minister Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru instituted the temples of modern India for as the public sector, in the public sector, to support for the nation building process. As we all know, India was a country which was almost fully looted, and we had our economy was in doldrums, or we were our people were near to poverty at almost all segments, and this was a collective of different diversities. And government had to find out funds for investing in huge infrastructures, heavy industries, and also the research institutions. Many of the growth pillars that we had was constituted by the government in as we all know, as a part of the 5-year plans that we had subsequently. And this is the base of the public sector movement in the country. And with that, so with this, there was never a thought of this type of private sector versus public sector when the economy started. But as it moved, there was, as we all know, I'm not going into the entire details, my role is limited here. But as this moved on, there and with the advent of the new economic policy 1991, where the privatization move was started, and that from that day onwards, or from those times onwards, we started hearing a debate, private sector versus public sector. So uh, this is still continuing, but we can, I think, the as a trade unions, and all the public sector, all the advocates of public sector, or those who understand the real value of public sector, have been successful in postponing this rampant privatization movement to this time. But as we know, as Comrade Franco already pointed out, there is the government is hell-bent on shifting this into large for the benefit of the large corporates. And privatization is now very much enthusiastically followed by the government. So it is at this point where we are seeing that these public sector banks are also getting privatized, and there is a lot of privatization happening, disinvestment happening in the public sector, from the public sector, for supporting the private corporates or private individuals. So at this point, we are starting to discuss, and this particular topic, the relevance is that. So earlier, when the privatization move was started from 1991, we were hearing about the deficiencies of the public sector, as lack of efficiency, corruption, lethargy of the employees, the take it easy policy, etc., red tapeism. All these were said to be the defects or the negatives of public sector. Whereas on the other hand, efficiency, quick decision making, leveraging of technology, and modernization tactics, etc., were said to be the pluses of private sector. But as we know, the pluses of private sector will definitely be the plus minuses of public sector, and the pluses of public minuses of private sector will be that of public sector. Like there is no juxtaposing public versus private, but it is the needs of the society at large which should decide which is the sector that which is the mode of development. And as in the right from the beginning, India was supporting a mixed economy formula. And it is under this background, and as a trade union leader also, I would like to add that from the side of the employees, the organized workforce. So in banking also, we are part of the organized workforce. Even though I am working in a private sector bank, we have been part of the public sector because of the policies of the government, as well as the nature of the social banking concepts that was introduced. And all the private sector at that point of time also were forced to undertake all the socially relevant programs and the rules and regulations of the country towards social needs. So, and in this concept, we were also having the public sector character, and this public sector character was retained by the involvement of the organized trade unions in these sectors. So the organized workforce is able to bring in more relevant working conditions, as well as improvement in working conditions, as well as to make the level of welfare, as well as the salaries, wages, and all the other welfare benefits to the workforce. So this is also being as a bar or a testing bar for all the other sectors, the private sectors as well. So there is importance of trade union, and as part of trade union, the organized workforce, we have always been trying to retain the qualities of public sector, and working for more efficient delivery to the masses that we are attending to. So it is more public sector is catering to more masses. So I'm not, so my role, we have very eminent speakers today who are well versed in these topics. So with these opening remarks, I would like to invite Comrade Murali Sundarajan, our beloved President of All India Bank Officers Confederation and General Secretary of Indian Overseas Bank, a veteran leader of banking trade union movement, to deliver his address. Comrade Murali Sundarajan.
Am I audible? Good evening.
Yes, yes, sir.
Good evening, Madam and Dr. Anita, President of the webinar, Franco, and the eminent speakers lined up to speak on the topic of the day, plus and minus of privatization. A very raging topic of the day, and necessitated by the moves of the government today, which proudly propagates the philosophy that to be in business is not the business of the government. In fact, the address of the Honorable Finance Minister during the budget session under the guise of Atmanirbhar, wherein the professed policy of keeping the key sectors of the economy under the government control had been given a go by the policy pronouncement that the government wants to restrict its presence in the major, even in the major critical centers, to 6 in numbers. So has given rise to a heated discussion among the intelligentsia and the right-thinking people of the society, whether the course followed by the government is right. So obviously, the corollary of the thinking would be to have a debate on the plus and minus of the privatization. In fact, India since independence, since 1947, has the economic roadmap of the country had been subjected to a very thorough discussion, and the industrial policy resolution right from 1948 clearly laid the roadmap of the country. When the resources of the country had been very rare, the capital of the country had been abysmally low, where, as Madam Anita put it, the temples of worship could not be constructed with the private capital. The government thought it fit that it is the role of the government to come to the forefront to build big industries, which would prove to be an avenue of employment and probably propel the economic development of the country.
Some problem. There is, I think there is some issue with Comrade Murali's line.
His connection got disconnected.
Okay, okay. So we'll wait. We'll wait a few minutes. Yes. Kindly unmute, sir. Unmute.
Yeah, 1 minute. I have unmuted. Okay. So this became a very, these temples of worship and the economic endeavors of the government provided a right impetus to the social development of the masses also, because the deprived sections of the society had a share in the progress, and they also progressed while the country progressed also. After the neoliberal economic policies were thrust upon the country under the guise of efficiency of the private sector, wherein the actual fact was the public sector, which was hitherto delivering, was made to suffer, and an image was built around them as these vehicles of the government had outlived their utility, and there was an imminent necessity to permit the private players to enter the critical sectors of the economy. That was a bogus bill by the so-called powers that be, so that the neoliberal economic policies which they professed and which was advocated by the World Bank were allowed to be introduced into the country. So there had been obvious debate raging in the minds of the educated and the people who are availing the services also, whether these public sector entities have outlived their utility and whether in fact they are consuming the rare resources of the economy, which otherwise could have been deployed for the economic development of the country. So a SWOT analysis of the economic policies so far being practiced by the government became inevitable, and the push for privatization gained momentum, and always there was a raging controversy, and always there had been an agitating minds on the subject, whether private sector is desirable or public sector is desirable, whether the Nehruvian policy of socialism so far being practiced in the country has outlived the utility. My search on the private side, on the plus side of the privatization, had very few greener points, comrades, very few greener points, and I could not find them to be more valid and more empathetic when we compare ourselves with the minus side of the privatization. Comrades, one of the main reasons why this topic is floated around, and I being a trade union of the banking side, could not help myself to draw parallels from the experience we have come across, which we had empirical evidence, I should say. In fact, the past 2 days, Professor Krishnan Kumar had been a very elaborate, he laid to the viewers a lot of statistics which supported the view that it had been the public sector banks which had been in the forefront of the development plans of the governance, and it had been the public sector banks which had really helped in the economic, in reducing the economic deprivation of the people, and in fact uplifting the downtrodden sections of the society, more so when it pertained to the rural credit, where the main focus had been not on profitability, where the private sector refused to go, the private sector banks refused to operate to the benefit of the rural masses. In fact, they had been camouflaging their balance sheets by resorting to questionable practices, or rather unethical practices of building up the balance sheet so that to comply with the statutory guidelines of their lending to the priority sector being to a very specified percentage. And there had been repeated Goebbels propaganda of private ownership would provide higher efficiency, wherein the examples we have come across in our country, more so when it relates to the failures in the banking system, we have come across, the latest being Yes Bank. We have got a plethora of the failures of only the private sector bank, and it had been the responsibility has been it has been the responsibility of the public sector banks to come to the rescue of the ailing private sector banks. The recent example, which everyone is aware, the catastrophe which the Yes Bank had created, and it has been left to the State Bank of India to re-nourish the Yes Bank so that the public deposits which was placed in the bank could be safeguarded. And the government's prestige and probably their inefficiency and the lack of control in monitoring the and exhibited by the Reserve Bank of India did not come to the focus, because State Bank of India stepped in to stymie the discussions on the subject, so that when the Yes Bank resumed operations, everybody felt satisfied, and because State Bank became the managerial, took the managerial control of the Yes Bank. Now let us try to find out any facts which had pundits or effectively putting forth in favor of the privatization. And it is nothing but the crony capitalism, which is at a wild display, comrades, which is at a wild display. And the study of the privatized banks operating in the country probably throws a lot of empirical evidence that unethical practices are in a very rampant and over there. And in fact, they effectively manage the AFI mechanism and asset portfolio perusal of the controller by the dubious means, and the main focus why the government wants to disinvest itself. In fact, they have not come out to the public domain about what are the plans they want to adopt so far as it relates to this proposed disinvestment, whether they want to sell it off or they want to divest the portfolio of their holdings is not yet very clear, but it is just an effort on the part of the government to enrich the crony capitalists waiting in the wings to take over the humongous assets created by the public sector banks. And it is nothing but akin to selling a family silver, comrades. It is nothing but destroying the national assets of the country. And I think private sector, a lot of employees today in the public sector enterprises, be it the public sector enterprises or be it in the public sector banks, they have reneged their employment opportunities in the private sector. As you all know, a good proportion of the employees today belong to the age category of below 40, and many of them are technical graduates. And I think almost, they say, in the proportion term, it may work out around 70%, be it in the clerical cadre or in the supervisory cadre. We have amongst us technical people, technical graduates who are amongst us. They have reneged the career in the private sector, for they have realized that the private sector, there is no work-life balance. They are not entitled to a well-meant collective bargaining system. And it is their progress in the public and the private sector are entirely left to the will of few selected supervisors. So they have realized that the public sector has a better governance standards. It's a better governance standards. So they have realized the career in the private sector and chosen a public sector in the earnest desire to contribute to the nation building. In fact, the pride of serving, one of the greatest pride we have in serving a public sector is that we have meaningfully contributed to the nation building of the country. And another peril of privatization, I should say, another peril of the privatization, when you speak about the minus of the privatization, it will not recognize any of the reservations we have set in or we have enshrined in the Constitution for upliftment of the neglected sectors of the society, be it SC, ST, OBC, minority, and for them, as the motto is share profitability, and they are basically being a fly-by-night operators. We cannot expect the private sector. We cannot expect the private sector to be meaningful, to play a meaningful part in the nation development, and private sector obviously has little or ineffective grievance redressal system. In fact, today, when you compare the charges for banking, once again, I take you to the banking because we are more conversant with it. And once again, when we compare the charges which we are, the private sector banks charge vis-a-vis the private sector banks, you will be surprised that any attempts by a customer to step into high-profile private sector banks will attract a charge. If a customer steps into the bank, after 5 times, I think HDFC Bank charges around 100 per visit by a customer, wherein there has been no such restriction on the private. Of course, the charges by the public sector also come in for a criticism. Probably the speaker behind me will provide an ample address of the same. So, in effect, comrades, privatization will be privatization has a lot of perils at its door rather than the rather than the public sector. And while we go into the history, okay, a raging debate then occurs. Probably private sector in the country will be inefficient. Wherein, what about the private sector? We are not having a well-propelled private sector in the country. Why you are talking about always private sector of India? Why don't you compare yourself with the private sector in vogue abroad? Probably one country which professes by the private sector, if you compare, is so one country comes to your mind. It is none other than the United States of America. If you study the banking history and the rates of bank failures, it is more acute and more inefficient over there also. In fact, the subprime crisis would come to our mind, will rage our mind, wherein ultimately the government of United States. Pardon, sir?
तो 5वीं જે પૂરી થાય ને છેલ્લી 5वीं એનાથી ઉપર
some disturbance.
Disturbance that that person will be muted.
Okay.
Can I continue, sir?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you. In fact, the USA-based Wells Fargo Bank, founded in 1852, and which withstood global crisis in 2007, acquired the struggling Wachovia Bank. And there had been a spate of acquisition against this bank for having practiced a lot of questionable practices. They were selling insurance products against the without the knowledge of the customers, they were cancelling it for the sake of revenues from the insurance product and for the sake of enriching a few of the top guys over there. And ultimately, when the US Department of Justice took them to a challenge, and they paid, they accepted the mistakes and probably pleaded guilty of the charges, and they had to pay 3 billion as fine, comrades. And Australian banks undermined financial integrity also. And United Kingdom's Royal Bank of Scotland had a history of 300 years. In fact, the well-established and the long-cherished history, historically enriched private sector banks also has come in for a lot of questionable practices. In fact, in India, because of the sovereign guarantee and because we have been serving the rural public and the masses with a commitment, we enjoy a lot of confidence. In fact, I should say, many of the banks, in fact, I work in a bank which had been reporting losses right from 2013 and which had been under PCA. In fact, I represent an institution which had been, which is in the PCA for a longest period of time. We have never been bereft of the public confidence. In fact, one of the banks which public have placed confidence, we have turned the corner in the last financial year, making a impressive profit. That apart, in fact, in none of these working results of the bank have shaken the confidence of the public in the public sector banks of the country. And that one major reason is the confidence of the people that there is a sovereign guarantee, because majority of the shareholdings of this public sector bank, though many of us are listed, the holding of the government is a very substantial percentage, and that gives the banking public enormous confidence on the financial stability of the banks we are dealing with. Any attempts to privatize will give rise to questionable practices and adoption of unethical practices. For we are not having efficient regulator, all these. In fact, the demonetization or the has come, exposed more inefficiency on the part of the regulator, on part of the, in fact, in the recent demonetization also, Reserve Bank of India has yet to come out with the exact details of the money, demonetized notes being surrendered by the government. In fact, a lot of antiquaries are on the prowl, being unanswered by the Reserve Bank of India. So we are not having so much of robust mechanism of supervision over the banking sector. So it becomes very imminent on the part of the government to hold its control, to hold its stake, to hold its capital on the public sector banks of the country. And I hope that CFA and there are many intelligentsia who has jumped into the bandwagon to shoulder our responsibility. I'm very happy about it. And People First has unveiled a series of lectures. I am a part of it. I regularly listen to the lectures on the various bit. They have embarked on a broader unity of right-thinking individuals and conscious-driven people, so that let us put on the public domain and let us contribute in whatever means we want to build a wall of defense, and so that our message to the public. In fact, one of the very often repeated question is, having you guys are speaking for the public, and do you enjoy a public support? See, as of now, we are a service delivery institutions, and the public does not bother about the ownership, but we have to educate the public that what perils they can face if the ownership changes, and ethical driven governance gives way to unethically led business models, which they may have to face in future. It becomes our responsibility. And I said earlier, many of our members themselves, since they are graduates in technology, and they have stopped studying social sciences probably from 10th standard. So it becomes very imminent part of them to take a twin drive of educating the public and sensitizing the members, so that we carry on with the meaningful journey of building skill set among the members and sensitizing the public about the perils which the impending privatization would beckon on them, on the economy in general, and probably put the country in doldrums. I thank CSFA for the opportunity being given to you. And when Franco introduced to me, he said, I'm a very learned man. I stand corrected that I'm just a student deriving my lessons from the various speakers whom I am interacting with. I thank you for the opportunity given. Thank you, Comrade President. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Comrade Murali Sundarajan. He has in detail mentioned about touch upon the various aspects of private, pluses and minuses of private and public sector, and with more references from the banking sector, of which he is a part, and the unethical, the necessity for sensitizing the public and educating the public towards the relative benefits or the necessity of having the public sector was the final message that he was giving. So I think we can now listen to the next speaker, Comrade Priya Dharshini from Center for Financial Accountability. Comrade Priya Dharshini.
Okay, hi. Sorry about that. Good evening, everybody. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Thank you, People's First, for the collaboration and also initiating this debate. And the importance, and also it's a very interesting time that we have chosen to have this webinar series that started on the 19th, that's 19th July, yesterday, which was the Nationalisation of the Banks Day. And we had a very brilliant session yesterday. And it also runs almost a week-long series. And within this week also falls the 24th of July, which marks the 30th year of neoliberalization. So it's a very interesting time. And adding on to that, like currently, we all know the kind of onslaught that is there on PSUs. I think this time, while we have this threat of privatization that has been there for the last 30 years, currently it is literally an onslaught where almost every public sector is being privatized. And this monsoon session, which also incidentally that started yesterday, one is likely to see amendments to even the Banking Act that furthers the privatization of the public sector banks. So it is really a very crucial and important time that we are having these discussions, and also amidst the kind of protests that are happening. Like it is not just despite the lockdown, and even last year and the year before, we have seen so many protests like never before from various public sector unions and other rights movements and social rights group. Because today the attack is not just on the public sector, but on literally anyone who questions this government. So it is a crisis of democracy, as Devasahayam sir always puts it, that today is a crisis for democracy, and every protest, every opposition is kind of strengthening the fight against this kind of a fascism that we live in. So with that, like, I really thank both the chair and the previous speaker for laying grounds. And I also assume that Comrade Prasad is going to cover a lot on with respect to banks. So I would like to put my presentation in looking at what do we understand about privatization, because the obvious answer is that you sell public asset to a private business. So that is, yes, that's the obvious definition of privatization. But that is, to me, the last and actually the most easiest part of privatization, because when we say privatization, it is a part and parcel of a neoliberal agenda that lays grounds, that weaves narratives, that builds up to the selling, actual transfer of the ownership of public sector units. And I would like to concentrate a little bit on those aspects of it, the politics of privatization, the politics of neoliberalization, given the significance of the timing that we have already seen. So like even the very introduction that Comrade Franco gave, and Comrade Anita, that we have always been like a welfare state and a mixed from a welfare state to a mixed economy, but now we are going towards a stage where the government thinks that the government has no business in business. So in this transition, and in this time that people actually think that there are pluses to privatization, that there is a large wide support from the public for privatization, and that is something that we need to question of why is there that support. And I assume that is also why this particular theme has been chosen. So from my very very limited understanding of it, so I believe that this laying of ground, or like this building of this narrative, is one of the very important aspect of people actually thinking that there are pluses to privatization, there are advantages to privatization that one needs to actually look in. So what are these narratives? So narratives, as you all know, is something that is weaved, and it need not necessarily be truth, because when one chief minister thanks prime minister for free vaccines, like the rest of the country, we all know what is the condition of vaccine. So we know that it is a false narrative. We know there is absolutely no truth to it, but still those narratives are repeated and weaved and imposed on the mental framework of people, so that at some point that they kind of believe it. So one hand you have these narratives, and on the other hand you have certain concrete steps, and I will try to cover both of these in the time that I have. So in the narrative creation, the first one is, of course, laying ground. So when you need to create something, you need to prepare the ground for it. And how does neoliberalization, neoliberalism prepares this ground? One is definitely using the externalities. Like even in case of India, if you take, we say that, okay, it was in the 80s that or even before, the grounds were prepared. And especially, like, even though before also you had the World Bank kind of, was 80s that were more, kind of had a definite shift towards that. And that is also because of the oil shocks that were consecutive oil shocks that was happening, or the devaluation of the currencies. So neoliberalism always uses these externalities, or even in the current juncture, like how the pandemic is being used. Like very widely, we have so many countries being indebted in the name of credits, or to recover their economy, and they are perennially indebted after that. So every crisis, whether it is the pandemic or natural disasters or wars, and when there are no externalities that are there, you create one. And we know so many countries that where you destabilize the government, or you go in for war and create the ground for the foreign money to enter, or these multi-development banks to enter. And once they are in, and it is a very fancy, the fancier aspect of it is the second part, which is a creating of a visual that at one point, like how the US when it went, I mean, it always was a free market economy, and it created this narrative that if you work hard, you're going to be rich in like another 10 years, and you are going to have this land of freedom. So that kind of a golden or a imaginary utopia is being always sold, and that visual, even in India, like I remember in one of my classes that I took, one economist, he used to say, he was a very pro neoliberal person, and when he was talking about the LPG policies, he said, I used to go for conferences and all of this, and in many foreign countries, and but every day for my morning breakfast, when I have cereal in India, I used to hate it. And then one fine day, I walked into the store and I saw Kellogg's, and that was like, my life has changed. Something that is huge, or like development has finally reached India. So you are given these golden visuals, and to some, let's just take this example of airlines. Many of us, I don't know about many, but I've heard from many friends, particularly male, that they would rather prefer go on a private airline, or this was in conversation with another comrade, that rather than Air India, just because you see the air hostess, and not just in the airlines, but even when you go to any private institution, even ICICI Bank for that matter, that has been my or Airtel or any of this, like women of a particular age, a particular look up, are definitely hired, and that is also a kind of creating or giving a visual for, and specifically for a very male gaze. And not necessarily, but what we miss in that is that Air India actually gives a permanent employee, like they have their right as a worker, whereas in none of these other private sector that is there. Most of them are contract employees. Like we all know what the problem is. I don't have to tell you guys. So that kind of a visual that is being sold, and definitely this false idea of competition. As bankers, you all know that very well, of how when in the 90s or in 2000s, like when foreign banks was brought in, or like the sector was opened, like you keep feeding on this, oh, now there will be competition, now this idea of market is going to regulate itself, now there's going to be a fair competition. And we all know for a fact where it went. Like on a fair ground of competition, none of those private banks could actually even come closer to the public sector banks, and that goes for every other sector. So on a fair ground, there is no competition between the public and the private sector, but this a notion of a fair competition is always sold, and repeatedly so. And another thing which I think Comrade Sridhar also had put in the chat, of this idea of professionalism and efficiency that is sold again, and this is something that is kind of ingrained, like especially in the younger generations, that you think or associate public sector with like, oh, they are going to be rude, or like they won't give you a proper service. This idea of hospitality that is there, or they're going to talk very nicely to you, they are not going to entertain, like this comparison is constantly created, and very deliberately so. And and for most of these points, all I had to do was just give one particular data set, which I think especially after yesterday, which is circulated widely. This was from one person, Mr. Newton, which I think Comrade Franco also had quoted in one of his article, Newton Kumar's data, where he has taken the number of customers that public banks serve per employee, and comparing it to the number of customers that a private bank serve per employee. So SBI per employee, each employee of SBI actually cater to 1,680 customers, and HDFC, which is the top private bank, has 467, and ICICI 352. So there is literally no comparison. And you need to see the idea of competition, the idea of efficiency within these numbers of one employee catering to 1,618 in like SBI, or the highest, which is the Bank of Maharashtra, which has per employee catering to 2,500 customers. And then you have the highest or the biggest in the private, which has per employee, you have 467. And of course, even the lowest of the public sector bank is per employee, they are catering to 1,348 customers. And even in terms of the customer base, this is per employee, where when you look at an SBI, which has around 42 crore accounts or like customers, and HDFC, which has 5.6 crore. But these numbers are numbers that are never given out when these narratives are created, because these are, and not for a common person, that you always look at data and numbers and try to look at it, because it is more of what is being told and retold, and hence these narratives kind of play a very important part. And always privatization comes in parts, like it is always a divide and rule. That has been, whether it is the colonial powers or imperialist power or like a finance global capital, they always try to divide. And that is why most of the time, like it happens gradually, it happens sector by sector. Like we know the transport sector that was privatized, or electricity sector, or telecom, and always, and they know, and unfortunately for us, and very luckily for them, that we have it is right now the kind of unity that you have in amongst people to come together and fight privatization. Otherwise it is only, okay, it is this sector, their employees, they are going to fight it, like it's not my problem. Like the famous poem of First Day came for the leftists and communists, and I did not respond. So that is how it is, like and we have not, and today they are coming for us and all of us. And just that in this regime there is no distinction, but the general thing has always been that gradual and divide and rule policy. And these narratives on, and also this reiteration of lies, that what most of the time they say they are loss making, public sector, they don't work, or like they have lost. And but just yesterday also we saw a lot of this images circulating on social media of, like, even till today the public sector banks are actually making operative profits, that their loss has been made because of the provisions that they have. This is something that I think some of us are like tired of telling. Like we have told this over and over for the last 3, 4, 5 years, that, but the idea, and you can pick up any newspaper that is writing on privatization, that there is public sector banks is failing or it is in loss, but there is no reasoning out of why the loss is there. And it is never compared to the social, whenever the idea of profit is being talked, it is only talked in terms of number. I think in a recent statement on the nationalization day, AIBA had mentioned that, like in terms of social, they do not calculate it in terms of social profit, but just accounting, like how much is the number of people that public sector caters to, or the rural area, the idea of service that is there, which essentially was one of this thing of nationalization. So these are, in terms of narratives, you have this. And the second one, the more dangerous one, and which always happens in the background, are the concrete steps. Like while you have this very golden narrative of, once privatization happens, things are going to change. Like there is going to be efficiency, professionalism, everybody are treated very correctly. I mean, in the visual, also the infrastructure, the way things look matter a lot, like in the buildings, the glass, they look professional, is what we say, the uniforms they wear and all of those. But that narrative, or like the visual on one hand, and then in the background you have you have policy changes. Like, because when you say, let us just take the example of loss-making public sector banks and NPAs. And banks, commercial banks were not in the game of funding or giving credits to large-scale projects. That was the job of developmental banks. And you slowly, it was through actual policy changes that was shifted. Like, those development banks were literally killed. And even when the decision was taken, we have it in records in the RBI, in everywhere, that it is fundamentally wrong to ask a deposit-based, a financial institution to finance long-term large-scale projects. So they know it is fundamentally there is a problem, and it is recorded everywhere, and they still went for it. And that was a policy change that was imposed on the banks. And once that is done, then the banks went for it. And again, banks were also sold. It is not just that you need to sell things to the public. You also need to sell things to the employers, that, you are going to, the economy is going to open up for you. You don't have to just invest in give credits to these farmers, and you don't have to have field officers running around like, every other day. And these people always say, like, there is drought, there is this, there is that. And your work is going to get simple, that you just have to give like one loan instead of like the 10-20 smaller loans that you're going to give. You have to give one loan and then you sit. And these are big companies, these are big corporates, and they're going to repay you on time. You can just, your work is going to get very easier. And you can invest in so many sectors, anything that you want to. And even till today, we consider 2000 in the banking history. We think 2003 or 2002 is considered to be the credit boom era, because then sectors were open and you could invest. You could give credit to any of these businesses. But the impact of it, we see today. Like, did the corporates give back your money? What happened? I mean, we do have like 2008, but the NPA started accumulating way before the financial crisis. Like, even in 2004, 5, 6, like, we had like a very steady building of NPAs. And in 2008, it was a very different scene. And then we know the rest is history. And on the other kind of policy changes, there is like reduction or like no safeguards. And when they knew that these are banks which are commercial banks, which are working accountable to the public with the public money, and for that there is hardly safeguards. Like, when they are giving those credit out to those large companies, and for a smaller loan, you need collateral. I mean, you all know all the things that you need, and how many times our phrasing has been amended to make it more stringent. So much so that people have been protesting against it. So much so people have actually committed suicide against, because of this act. And also today, like, the bad loans are being just sold on to some private companies, and they have harassed, and a lot of people have literally been forced to commit suicide. And but when it comes to the bigger or the larger companies, there are hardly any safeguard policy. And this is not just for the banks. Like, even today, with the labor laws being changed and the environmental clearance, like, today you have companies that can give its own clearances, saying that we have all the safeguards. And just from last year, the number of so-called accidents that has happened in various industrial complexes, that shows, the life, or like, safeguards is something that they do not care. It is only a very pro-profit this thing. And today you also have this thing that, okay, how you enter like crony capitalism. Like, once this idea of credit ratings, and today credit ratings are something that can be brought, like the entire, even after, like to go for credit ratings, look at credit ratings and take this thing after the financial crisis is something that is one of the most stupid things. Like even when we are doing some research or, you know, in our own work, like we look at, oh, Moody has rated this, but then you like just think like, you know, they rated like Goldman Sachs and all of these bankers to be the top of the thing, and how these are bought in. And this idea of that privatization or like private things are going to have less corruption is something that is a complete total myth. Like even with banks, the RBI, the previous RBI governor had mentioned that how in the last 5-6 years, the number of frauds have actually increased. And the idea, and even when you are going to privatize, like how much can a public sector unit like pay in terms of like the, whether it is the sales or like to ministers or any, there is nothing. So basically the why most of the government or like the ministers, they want to go for it or they don't care, is also because of their own idea of like gaining short-term money. Like you have today instituted corruption, like whether it is a PM cares or the electoral bond or anything. So these are actually instituted form of corruption, that all these corporates are actually giving money to the government, and the government has to do its duty. Like instead of the people, today we know where the masters and who is a master and who is a servant. And in terms of other concrete policies, like you also reduce human resource, you break up unions. And one thing that Comrade Franco keeps repeating is the representative of employee and officers, union representatives in the board. And that is deliberately kept vacant. And the human, like you have cut down on human resource. Like at one point, like I think there is even a committee report that says human resource is one of the crises that the banks are actually facing, that you do not have officers, like almost more than 90% are vacant. And there then you bring in, I think in one of the last sessions, somebody was presenting of how all the executives are someone who is brought in, who are like closer to the government. So that is another, a crisis that you create within the banks of reducing the employees and not having permanent employees and only having contract workers, and then incentivizing. And this again goes back to the idea of this false notion of the competition, that okay, you work more, you get paid more. So it does not work like that. But this idea is being sold once more. And I think the final one that is sold is Tina. There is no alternative. That you create this thing, like as we saw, the policy changes which leads to NPA, and then you say that, oh, now banks are running in loss, now this is running in loss. But when you say that, the history of the slow changes that have happened, all of that is completely taken off the context. Similarly, when we talk about efficiency or professionalism or profit, the entire this thing of how many percent that one public employee serves, that is completely taken out of context. So then you just say these general statements that they are making loss, there is no alternative. And this you can see across sectors. And once you go into that situation, and when this narration is kind of coupled with the smoke screen of the concrete steps that have been taken to create this narration, because privatization or neoliberalism is not just, as I started, it's not just like selling public sector thing to a private partner, but it's a paraphernalia of things. It's an entire politics that is there to kind of ensure how this thing is worked. So with this thing, then you have people thinking that maybe privatization works. And I think that is where coming back to where Comrade Franco started. So that is why we need to now debate whether there is plus and minus in privatization. Because as the previous speaker also said, and I think the coming speaker is also going to say, there is hardly any pluses. But also, like where I was just talking to another comrade Ashok Chaudhary this morning, and he just summed it up in one word. Maybe there are pluses in privatization, but is it useful for the people? Does people matter in that? If it doesn't matter to the people, then it doesn't matter. Like the pluses don't matter. Like it could be a wonderful thing, but if it does not serve the interest of the people, if you're going to, through privatization, exclude and alienate a whole a vast majority of the people of this country, then even if it is good, it does not matter, and it should not. But we know that it is not, and hence it is all the more important that it is not alienate but push people into poverty, and not just privatization, the entire context and the politics that we are dealing with today, and with the government that is deliberately pushing anti-people policies, and anti-national policy. These policies, and I think we need to start calling it that, then these are anti-national policies that are against the interest of the people and the nation, and of selling your assets, and not just selling your assets, and spying on all form, like journalists or executives. It does not matter. So this entire the political scenario that we are right now, I think it is very important for us to oppose not just privatization, but to unitedly oppose all of it. It is as important as for bankers to talk against privatization, to also talk about the political prisoners or the farmers or the labor laws that are changed. Because without that, because that is something that has also been missing from our part, that idea of united struggle, which is also why neoliberalism has been able to survive for 30 years. And today, right now, when in every other country we see this demand for nationalization, whether in France or UK, in all of these countries, which is being showed as which is why we are actually privatized. This global standing up to this global mark is something that is always sold to us. But today the trend is that people are on the streets demanding nationalization or demanding public sector, and that is also something that we need to take to our people. And I just like how we are here in your struggle, I really hope you will also give us solidarity, and together we can fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Priya. Just to sum up in one or two lines, so the whole politics of privatization, that was the main thread that Priya was covering, and basically touching on the myths or the visualizations, or the way in which narratives are repeated, and how an impression of a better prosperity is inculcated or infused into the minds of the public at large, and the younger generation, so that the idea of privatization appears to be a better one. So that was the basic thread on which she was commenting on the whole aspects and the benefits of or the importance of public sector for the benefit of the people at large of the country. And now I would request Comrade V.K. Prasad, my own leader. I'm happy to be part of this program while he is there. So I invite Comrade V.K. Prasad for his address. Our veteran leader, Comrade G.D. Nadaf, is also present in this program. Welcome is already done. I am happy to see Comrade G.D. Nadaf, our former General Secretary of All India Bank Officers Confederation, in this meeting, in this webinar. So over to Comrade V.K. Prasad.
Comrade Dr. Anita, President of the meeting, my dear friend and disciple, Comrade Murali, President of AIBOC, Srimati Priya from CFA, Comrade G.D. Nadaf, veteran leader of AIBOC, Comrade Franco, and my dear friends and comrades. A lot has already been talked about the plus and minus of privatization. Of course, as rightly suggested by Comrade Anita in the beginning, it is the perceived efficiency of the private sector that was projected as the most important rationale for ringing in the reforms way back in 1991. And 30 years are past now. And of course, it's worth examining where we stand as of now. After these 3 decades of the reform era, it is of course worth examining how the privatization has fared and all. So naturally, we need to examine in detail what the very concept of privatization and public sector means, and why these 2 concepts are there. Now, of course, all of us are aware that public sector, of course, is not expected to be a panacea for all the ills of the country or its economy. But of course, public sector was projected as a solution for many evils that confronted the world economy way back in 1930s, when the whole world was confronting a big crisis in the form of the Great Depression. And that was where public sector arose. Till then, there was absolutely no concept of public sector. Because ever since the Industrial Revolution took place way back in the middle of the 17th century, it was the heyday of laissez-faire. Ever since Adam Smith introduced the concept of private enterprise through his book Wealth of Nations, private enterprise, private capital ruled the world economy. In fact, private investment or private enterprise was supposed to be the engine for economic growth. But then we witnessed during the middle of last century the big crisis that the world landed in. The world landed into a big crisis. Of course, the world confronted 2 world wars. In between, this Great Depression occurred. And history tells us that all these, the 2 world wars, as well as the Great Depression, all of them were the outcomes of a failed economic model pursued by the capital, rather private capital. So it was when private enterprises failed that public sector was enunciated. Public sector was, of course, was introduced as part of the New Deal theory by J.M. Keynes. And the very concept of public sector was meant to revive the world economy. And the concept was simple. See, the rampant dominance of private sector, the rampant prominence and domination of capital in the economy, that ended up in a sort of a disproportionate accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few people. And naturally, that affected the purchasing capacity of the whole world. Majority of the people were affected. Majority of them were in distress. And it was in such a context that the eminent economist James Keynes, he introduced the concept of this New Deal theory, and this public sector, the dominance of public sector was in fact a major part of his theory. And he told that by way of public sector, what the government is doing, what the state is doing is to preside over the economy. The reins of the economy will be in the hands of the government, and the economy will be regulated. All the activities will be regulated. And this regulation will ensure that the wealth accumulation does not take place. And a more equitable, a more balanced distribution of wealth will follow. This was the concept by which the public sector was introduced. Now let us look back and let us introspect. Where has this gone wrong? Say during the last almost 80 plus years, we have witnessed that the whole world has progressed enormously. And more than 60–70% of the people around the world, they are living a better life when compared to the lives of their predecessors during the middle part of the last century. So how did it happen? It happened sheerly because this public sector concept and the increased intervention of the government and the dominance of the government in the market that ensured a more balanced distribution of wealth. And that was how a big crisis was averted. And that was how the world was brought out of the big crisis into which it landed during the Great Depression. So this is the concept of public sector. Now, what happened was, naturally, the first and foremost task of public sector is, of course, the well-being of the economy. And coming to the banking sector, what's the role of public sector? See, here exactly the same thing has happened. A more balanced distribution, a more balanced and widespread redeployment of the resources. See, what is essentially banking? Banking is redeployment of funds, and banks are expected to play an intermediary role. So through this intermediary role, the banks are ensuring a balanced, an equitable redistribution of wealth, and this redistribution of wealth will naturally result in a better development and expansion of the economy. This is what happens, and this was what happened in India post nationalization. See, as we know, one single point, one single fact will vouch for the performance of public sector banks. In 1969, the GDP growth of the country was less than 2%. To be precise, it was 1.85%. Now, in 1990, when the country was in the midst of a big crisis, foreign exchange crisis and all, the country clocked a GDP growth of 4.85%. So from 1.85% way back in 1969, that's before nationalization, to near about 4.85% after 30 years, after 20 years, after 20 years. That is something phenomenal. This was what happened. And that itself vouches for the phenomenal role, the epochal role played by the banks in shaping the economy of the country. So then again comes the attack from the private sector. Now at this point, I would like to make a distinction between the concept of private sector that prevailed during the early days of independence and during the neoliberal days. During the early days of independence, as rightly told by Anita, public sector enjoyed a commanding position in the economy. according to Nehru, public sector denoted the commanding heights of economy, whereas private sector was supposed to play a supplementary role. Now, why that supplementary role? That precisely was because the private sector was supposed to bring in private capital, private investment. And that was meant to be a supplementary role, surely because of the dearth of funds on the government side. The government was running short of funds. It was just post-independence, and we needed huge funds for the overall development of the country. We didn't have industries. The agriculture was in shambles, and the employment front was a big zero. So in such a scenario, we needed investments. And of course, the government, those days, the government envisaged a bigger role for the public sector. But at the same time, private sector was supposed to play a supplementary role in the form of bringing investments, much needed investments. But that was not at the cost of the interests of the country. That supplementary role was expected to supplement the efforts of the government in improving the economy, in creating more jobs, and in improving the purchasing capacity of the people. This was the perceived role of privatization those days. But during the neoliberal privatization period, post-1970, the entire scenario has changed. Now, privatization means sheer profit maximization. And again, those days, private sector was supposed to play a supplementary role, but post-liberalization, private sector has started dominating the scene. Here, it is absolute non-intervention of state. The state, the government is withdrawing. That is the very mantra of this LPG policy. There is no role. The government, which was supposed to preside over the economy during those days, during the days of Keynesian economics, its role was reduced to that of a mere facilitator for the private capital. And then the government was conspicuous by its absence as far as its intervention is concerned. And the regulation part, that was given a go-by. There was absolutely no regulation. The regulation was left to the market. So in short, market was the god, or market is the god rather. Market is the god. And government is now playing second fiddle. Those days, private sector was playing a supplementary role, but now the government is playing a second fiddle to the private capital. Of course, the government is playing a role we should appreciate. What role is the government playing? The government is, of course, going out of all its limits. It's overstretching itself to crush and to suppress all types of workers' agitations occurring anywhere in the country against the crank exploitation unleashed by the neoliberal capitalist forces. This is what is happening. So this is the huge difference between the private enterprise during the early independence days and the private enterprise during these days. So this is, of course, a big difference. And now, in 1990, this LPG was brought in with certain rationales. Of course, many previous speakers spoke at length about these perceived advantages of the private sector. See, some of them, the efficiency aspect. Private sector was projected to be much efficient when compared to public sector. And when private sector was hailed as a more competitive sector, and then again, they were hailed for their modernization efforts. And they were projected to bring in more investments. And again, it was suggested, it was propagated that private investments are techno-savvy they will leverage more on technology. And again, of course, all this ran on the back of another perceived negative aspect of the public sector, namely mismanagement. Mismanagement. Particularly, the public sector banks were blamed for this, the so-called mismanagement. Why? Because they were blamed for writing back profits from non-performing accounts. There was absolutely no concept of NPS, and there were no special mechanisms for recovery, and they were blamed that no collection is being made. Nothing is coming back. No repayment is made. Still, you are applying interest, and then you are crediting the amount to the profit and loss account, and thus you are showing a hollow profit, a non-existent, unreal, imaginary profit. And again, they were blamed for the pile-up of small loans. A number of loans, government sector, scheme loans, schematic loans and all, under PMRY. Then those days, there was a concept called IRDP, Integrated Rural Development Program. Then again, self-employment programs for the unemployed segments, for the women, for the weaker sections and all. So it was told that the public sector banks are ruining the economy. They are pilfering the money. They are squandering the resources of the country. So they were blamed for this mismanagement. And I remember those days, the Reserve Bank even told that 85% of the non-performing assets in the banking sector were on account of these schematic lendings, these small loans. And that was the reason they projected for bringing in the Basel norms. Those days, many people told that these Basel norms are thoroughly unsuitable for Indian conditions. India, if at all we want certain norms, that should be conducive to the Indian environment. That should not be a mere replica of the norms adopted by the United States and other developed countries. But that fell in deaf ears. It was copied here. And then the excuse was this, that the public sector banks are mismanaged, that they were loaded with a lot of small loans, 85% of which are NPS. So these were the reasons. So in short, privatization, the new kind of private sector, the neoliberal kind of private sector, was projected as the panacea for the ills confronting the Indian economy. So this was had. And again, as all of you are aware, the license strategy was given a go by. This was what the government told. This was what the government was propagating, that the license strategy is ending, private enterprise is coming, and private investment is coming. Private initiative will take the country forward. And then the trickle-in theory was introduced. What was this trickle-in theory? If at all people at the top, they make more money, you need not worry. It will trickle down to the lower layers, and ultimately it will reach the lowest layer, and thus the country will flourish, the economy will flourish, everybody will be lifted above the poverty line and all. This was the argument put forward by the protagonists of the LPG theory. But now 30 years are passed. What do we see? We see that this neoliberal private sector is a failed model. Of course, I am supposed to speak on the plus and minus of private sector. But frankly, as Comrade Priya told, I cannot perceive anything positive in the neoliberal kind of private sector. Why? Because in the neoliberal kind of private sector, what is happening? The government is given a go by. The market is dominated by the capital, and the capital is engaged in mobilizing all available resources from everywhere, and all these resources are channelized and are made a part of the global capital. And in the process, the banking industry is made to be a conduit to promote this kind of wealth concentration. See, I hope at least some of my listeners would be aware. See, Friedman was one among the enunciators of the LPG reforms, the Washington Consensus. I remember once he told about the banking companies in the United States, that the banking companies should not be mere museum pieces. They should be like the vehicles in the parking ground, which means that they should always be on the move. They should always make money. They should always try to maximize profit. They should not be like museum pieces. So this was the theory that prompted President Clinton to give a go-by to the Glass-Steagall theory way back in 1990s. And that was how this private capital was given a free hand in the US economy. And after that, see, a free hand was given across the world, and that has resulted in again an accumulation of wealth. And this accumulation of wealth has landed the world in another crisis. And we are witnessing this crisis ever since 2008. Even now, we are in the midst of that crisis. So how can we justify, or how can we put up any excuse for the perceived virtues of privatization? It has proved itself to be a failed model. And again, one aspect that has been proved in the process is that the new private sector, the neoliberal private sector, if it was a success at any point of time, it was sheerly because of the privatization of profits and nationalization of losses. That was the only reason. That was the only ground on which private sector could perform under the guise of neoliberal reforms. This is not my own. See, I hope you will remember Joseph Stiglitz, the former advisor of the then United States president. He was one among the ardent advocates of LPG reforms. But 2 decades down the lane, he openly regretted his stance. He rejected the principle, he rejected the concept of privatization, LPG. And he told that a balanced growth can never be ensured by virtue of this rampant privatization. He agreed that public sector has got a major role to play. He agreed that the governments should have a major role, a presiding role over the economy. And this was again vouched by Thomas Piketty in his book, Capital in the 21st Century. In that book, Piketty has proved that if at all private sector has performed during the neoliberal regime, it's really because of the maxim, which I told you earlier, privatization of profits and nationalization of losses. So this is the result. So it shows that the very concept or the very rationale projected way back in 1919 for the introduction of private sector in India is a myth. Where is the perceived efficiency? So I can tell you certain instances. See, for example, let us think of the Global Trust Bank. Where is it now? Global Trust Bank was launched with much fanfare, but then ultimately a public sector bank was invited to save it. And I remember when I was state secretary of AIBOC, and I was also the convener of the UFBO Kerala unit then. It was during those days, way back in 2004, the ICICI Bank, the New Gen Bank, attempted to take over Federal Bank, one among the all generation private sector banks in which I was working, in which our comrade Anita is working now. I still remember when ICICI Bank was trying to swallow Federal Bank, ICICI Bank was actually in a very, very critical stage. I still remember it was in 2004. In 2003 budget, the then finance minister had introduced the concept of asset reconstruction companies. And he had set apart 3,000 crore rupees as capital for the asset reconstruction company. And please note the point that that asset reconstruction company, the first of its kind, was announced in the public sector. And 3,000 crore was earmarked from the budget. And I still remember in 2004, it was ICICI Bank which dipped funds from this asset reconstruction company. They sold many of their NPAs to the asset reconstruction company, and that was how they showed profit that year. Had that asset reconstruction company been not there in 2004, ICICI Bank would have shown loss in 2004. So then how can we accept the myth of better efficiency? And again, see, there are many other glowing examples in the world arena. Look at the crisis in world 2008. We know about the insurance group AIG. We know about many other banks, Lehman Brothers and all, which disappeared. Let us forget all about that. Let us think of Citibank. Citibank, those days, Citibank was headed by an Indian person. They were given a credit line of $400 billion by the US government. It was the US Treasury that bailed out Citibank then. Otherwise, Citibank would have closed the shutters. And of course, it is true that they repaid the money later, but the Treasury, the public money, was called in to save Citibank when the crisis erupted. And I remember during those days, immediately after crisis, the famous economist Richard Pitt, he had come out with a very scathing attack on the private sector. In that, he exposed the fallacy of the private sector. With special reference to the American economy. He proved that the American banks were showing artificial results with the aid of rating agencies and consulting agencies. It was in fact a nexus. The rating agencies were giving fallacious ratings, and the consulting agencies, they were painting a rosy picture about the banks. All of them were conspiring to conceal the real picture of the banks. This was the position then. And again, Richard Pitt proved that the banks adopted dubious methods to show results. They were exerting pressure on the chief executives. They were offering them huge incentives. They were offering them disproportionate salaries. And they were even offering them part of ownership in the form of ESOPs, employee stock options and all. Thus, the chief executives and other senior fellows, they were lured to perform. They were lured to show results. And that was how the exotic derivatives, dangerous, risky derivatives were introduced. And that was how the private capital was trying to perform those days. So my question is, where is this concept of perceived efficiency? And again, see, coming back to the Indian scene, I told you earlier, the excuse projected by the government those days, way back in the 90s, for introducing Basel norms was that 85% of the NPAs in the banking sector were on account of the small loans. But what's the position today? 85% of the NPAs in the banking sector are certainly, without doubt, on account of the corporate loans. So the wheel has turned a full circle. Basel norms were introduced under the excuse of the small loan NPAs, but now corporate loans are a chunk of the loans, a chunk of the NPAs. And again, what is happening? These NPAs are digging the very, very foundation of the banking system. The entire capital is being utilized. See, the other day, a very embarrassing news appeared in the media about State Bank of India. The news says that State Bank of India has diverted funds out of the pension fund of the employees for capitalizing the NPAs. And now, see, yesterday it was Nationalisation Day. Nationalisation Day is the day on which nationalization is remembered and celebrated. But yesterday, the newspaper came out with another embarrassing news that the Reserve Bank has given permission for 8 banks to launch a private asset reconstruction company with a capital of 8,000 crore. And with this 8,000 crore, these public sector banks will start an asset reconstruction company in which 51% of the ownership will be borne by the public sector companies. Remember, it's a noteworthy point. In the case of a bad bank, majority of the ownership is in public sector. And where is it coming from? They have to tackle 14 major loans. And how much is the amount kept in those 14 NPAs? 89,000 crores. So that means that a lot of haircut is going to take place. Haircut means loss of capital. Loss of capital means loss of public money. So this is what I told you in the beginning. This is nothing but privatization of profit and nationalization of losses. The losses of the corporates are being nationalized under the guise of this bad bank, under the guise of CDR. You will remember, now the public sector banks are shown in poor light on account of these NPAs. Actually, these NPAs have a history from 2008 onwards. And most of these NPAs are on account of the huge infrastructure lending given for the big infrastructure projects. Many of them, near about 600 projects, were forsaken, abandoned in between. And the big amount was caught up there. So I would like to cut short due to paucity of time. So this is the crisis. So how can we say that the private sector has performed well? How can we argue that the private sector is one notch better compared to public sector? It's maximization of profit, one. And secondly, on the other hand, the entire resources in the country. I would in fact blame even the public sector banks now for this. Even the public sector banks are playing the role of a conduit, an agency for channelizing the funds in the bank to the stock market in the form of third-party products. This is what is happening. In that way, they are promoting the accumulation of wealth. They are promoting the concentration of wealth. What is required? What is the concept of nationalization? It is distribution of wealth. Privatization aims at concentration of wealth. Nationalization focuses on the distribution of wealth. So even the public sector banks are now made an agency to promote this wealth concentration. So that way, the very concept of public sector is defeated. And what happens ultimately? People are defeated. Because the people are the owners of the resources. They are entitled for the resources. The resources are owned by the entire people of India. But now, under the guise of this rampant neoliberal privatization, all these resources are allowed to be cornered, accumulated, and concentrated in the hands of in a few hands. That will bring the ruin of the country. That will, of course, that will sound the death knell of the economic sovereignty of the country. So, my dear friends, I would like to conclude the perceived efficiency of the private sector has not done anything good for the country. Rather, that efficiency was misused to corner the resources, to maximize profit, to adopt the unethical ways, and to sideline the government as a mere facilitator. So this is where we have to step in. Why the public sector is targeted? The public sector is seen as a stumbling block for this concentration efforts, this wealth accumulation efforts, because I told you, public sector means distribution. So long as public sector plays a commanding role in the economy, in the banking sector, the design, the intention of this concentration will not work, will not be effective. That's why the government is now seeking to categorize banking as a strategic sector as part of this Atmanirbhar package. And if that categorization as strategic sector is implemented, then the number of public sector players will be reduced to 3 or 4. So why that is done? That is done with the sheer intention of destroying the public sector, so that the private sector gets a free hand to promote their agenda of wealth concentration. This is something we need to fight. This is something the entire patriotic forces in the country are required to fight. And a collective resistance is required to defeat the evils of privatization. Thank you for the patient listening, and I may be excused if I crossed my time limits. I conclude. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade Prasad. So it was indeed a very long narration, right? Starting from the historical background. It was more like a class with a very sequential presentation of the movement of privatization, the concept, the conceptualization, and the different roles or the different ways in which the private capital and the public sector roles were shifted over the years, and it was a lot of insight into the flow of events. So thank you, Comrade Prasad, for the elaborate introspection of the entire movement, right from in the Indian scenario as well as in the global perspective. So it was indeed like a long session on a complete session on a complete class on the series of events and the real issues that are the perception as well as how this is affected and how the whole wheel has turned a full circle. So now we are able to realize and feel that the ill effects of privatization in a more specific manner. So I think now we can take questions, if any. With all the three speakers have spoken about basically everyone has come to a conclusion, or more they were coming to a point that the ways of privatization is not good for the people at large. So it is more of profit maximization or profiteering for the private sector entities, so that wealth is there is a concentration of wealth rather than distribution of wealth, and the widening inequalities. So that is the final, or we can conclude by saying that this is the real problem. So it is not addressing the real aspirations of the people, or it's not helping the people. And so there is a larger role for the private public sector or the government to take care of the people and the distribution of wealth, so that inequalities are reduced. And more so, the government is also intervening for supporting it is not that the perceived efficiency of the private sector is also not correct, because government is pumping, or it is from the treasury or from the budgeted funds through some vehicles like asset reconstruction companies or something supported by. Even in the case of S Bank, we saw that machinery was brought in, so that the S Bank was taken over with the support of State Bank of India, which means it's public funds. So there is larger use of public funds or the public resources for supporting the private sector losses or covering up the losses. And so this the perception that people have is to be corrected, and as the society or it should be a collective movement from the part of the patriotic people or the stakeholders, including the trade union people, to come and join together to support this movement of public sector, to retain the public sector, and to resist the rampant privatization that is now leashed out by the government. So there is a wider role that we have to play, an urgent intervention and urgent role that people like us have to play. And as Comrade Murali Sundarajan very rightfully said, it is for the people, or it is for the correcting the notions of the people, so that we can get into larger community, the society, so that this movement is reaching to the real government, reaching out to the government. The resistance is felt by the government. So that is the role that we have to play. With these words, I conclude. I think there are no questions in the chat box. So, Comrade Franco, can we conclude?
Except one clarification on Comrade V.K. Prasad
Yes.
about that transfer of funds from the pension funds of State Bank of India to its balance sheet. That is not a fact. It was only a
fake news.
Fake
It was a fake news. Yes.
Okay, I saw the comment in the chat box, Comrade Franco. I stand corrected, but of course, I was referring to the news item that appeared a few days back in some of the leading news dailies.
That's right. So, Comrade Nadav has been there full. Comrade Rajivan, former General Secretary of State Bank Officers Association, Kerala Circle, has been there full. And Comrade Sridhar Ramamurthy, an environmentalist. He is not a banker, but he is an leading environmentalist in the country. He had been sitting all through the session and putting his comments. Ilangovan from the Railway, Vice President of the Railway Federation, the DRUU, has been there full. And a number of friends from Northeast also has been there. So now we can request Ashish to propose vote of thanks.
Yes.
And announce tomorrow's program also. That I can announce. Tomorrow's session is on the role of directors in the bank. Independent directors, the officer employee directors who are no more there. But that will be a presentation from Comrade Nadav and Comrade T.R. Bhatt, who was in the board of Corporation Bank, and he was General Secretary of the Federation, and he was Vice President of AIBOC also. And one more person I will be confirming only tonight. So with that, there will be 3 presentations by people who had been in the boards of the bank, so that they can really speak the reality of what the boards do and what is the need for officer employee director. So that will be tomorrow at 7 o'clock. I request all of you to join, and also request more friends to join that session. With this, I think Ashish can propose for that. Ashish, you are there?
Hello. Thank you, Comrade Franco. As outside, so I thank Comrade P. Anita for chairing this session, and thank all the participants who joined this discussion on privatization today on all the platforms, Facebook, YouTube, and Zoom. And I also thank all the three eminent speakers for today's discussion, Comrade Murali Sundarajan and Comrade V.K. Prasad and Priya Dharshini for giving putting their views on the privatization and how to oppose the privatization drive of the current government. I request all of you to join the webinar tomorrow with the same link. We will be sharing the link again. Thank you everyone to join the discussion today.
So thank you all. The webinar is concluded. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Anita.
Yes.
Shall we leave?